I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today as well. So I'll do a quick intro of myself and then Val, and then I thought I might do a wee whip around the room because it's always great to know who's on the call and start to, have a bit of connection as much as it is difficult in the virtual landscape. So for those of you I've not met before, I'm Lisa Jackson. I'm on the OAR Network Executive Committee. I've worked in emergency management since 2009. I moved over after Black Saturday and began my emergency management career with Country Fire Authority based out of Seymour, which was one of the heavily impacted regions from Black Saturday. So I definitely learned a lot from the very start of my career. I definitely haven't looked back since entering emergency management. I'm sure a number of you might feel the same. You're almost addicted to the amazing networks that you can create and the connections that you have and all of the things that you'll learn and you're exposed to when you're in this sector. And I was lucky enough to meet Val, who's on the call today with me, during the completion of my Master of Emergency Management thesis a number of years ago now, probably about 5 years ago, I think. And that master's degree significantly elevated my career. So I thought it was a good opportunity when I was asked to, facilitate one of these conversations to bring Val in and to hear more about her so I can personally learn more about her, but also to share her with all of you, and we can learn about the relationship between tertiary education and emergency management as well. So to introduce Val, Associate Professor Valerie Ingham lectures in emergency management at Charles Sturt University. She is a founding member of the Disaster and Community Resilience Research Group, and her research interests include community resilience, disaster recovery, and the tertiary education of emergency management, emergency managers, and fire investigators. Over the last few years, her research has focused on highlighting the importance of local community organisations and building community connections for disaster resilience, with a particular focus on Bangladeshi and Australian communities. So what I thought is we might nip around the room, and if you could just say your name, what OAR chapter you belong to. And I'd love to hear, because one of my first questions for Val is, what did she want to be when she grew up? So I thought maybe if we all answer that question, it'd be a nice way to learn something more about each other. So name, what chapter you belong to, and what did you want to be when you were little? Alrighty, so I might start at the top and I'll say your name, and then if you can just answer those things. So Margaret, we'll start with you because you're at the top of the list.
Hi everyone, I'm in the OAR committee as well, and I belong to the Victorian chapter. And when I was little, I read a particular book, which I still own, and I wanted to be a child psychologist.
Oh, amazing. It's pretty awesome to be exposed to that so young. That's great. Kathy, you're unmuted, so we'll go with you next.
Hi everyone, I'm Kath Cooney. I'm in Victoria. I'm the secretary of the OAR network. I'll tell you when I grow up what I want to be, because it's changing, and I've already been for 5 or 6 quite different things. But I think now it's to do with emergency management, but we'll see.
That's great. Thank you for sharing. And Pickles.
Hi, and I'm in New South Wales. And when I was little, I wanted to be a librarian, which I've achieved at home, as you can see. I didn't really think I'd end up in emergency planning. So.
That's great. Thank you. And I love all of those books in the background. That's awesome. You've got a great location there. Well done. Ashley Brady.
Hi, everyone. I'm in the ACT chapter. And weirdly, an ornithologist.
What is that?
A study of birds.
Awesome. That's very cool. Thanks for sharing. Janine.
Hello, sorry, it wouldn't unmute. Hi, I'm in Victoria and I wanted to be a vet, but I failed maths all the way through school. I'm in the CFA and I've become passionate about emergency management, and particularly from the psychological point of view. So that's what I do when I'm working.
Amazing, thank you.
Thank you.
Jo Brown.
I'm hot.
Hi, I'm Jo, and I'm in Victoria, and I'm just a new member of the network. When I was little, a wee tacker, I wanted to be a stock and station agent because that's what my dad did. And to me, all he did was drove around and had scones in people's houses and counted cattle, and then went to the sale yards and had another big lunch and just hung out. So I thought, wow, what a great job. But he told me as a girl I couldn't do that. So terrible.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing. Kate T.
Hi, I'm in Victoria as well, and I think my earliest memory was probably wanting to be in the police force, and probably because I'd seen them riding horses. So I think that was more of the reason rather than the work that they did, but I don't know. Yeah, that's me.
Great, thank you. Catherine Haynes.
Hi, I'm in New South Wales. I'm at the University of Wollongong, a research fellow. And when I was little, the first thing I can remember wanting to be was a firefighter.
Oh, great. Thanks for sharing and welcome to the session. Chris Newton. Oh, Chris's technology isn't too great. I don't know if it's working yet. Oh dear. All right, well, we'll continue on. So Lucinda Miranda.
Hi. So I am, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Got no facial expressions. I am in Victoria, and I remember one of the earliest things I remember wanting to be was a fairy.
Oh, that's amazing. Thanks for sharing. Mandy Stewart.
Hi, Mandy here in Horsham, Victoria. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a nurse on the Queen's ship. And that was because we lived in Fiji when I was a child, and we'd, as a brownie, had gone and sat on the docks when the Queen and Prince Philip had arrived. And that's what I wanted to do. But I discovered I can't stand blood, so that was soon put aside.
Oh, thank you. Margaret, also known as Midge Gray.
Hi, I'm in Tasmania. I only just got back from being in Sydney. My mum died, so I'm back.
To hear that.
I had the pleasure, incidentally, of Val taking me through the Masters in Emergency Management, which is, and I volunteer for New South Wales Rural Fire Service, as well as SES New South Wales.
Great. Awesome.
And when I was a little girl, I wanted to be a policeman, police officer, but I was told I was too small.
Oh. Well, thank you for sharing and welcome to the session.
No worries. Michelle
Dunscombe, and I'm sorry if I butchered your last name.
No, that's all right. You nailed it. So yeah, I'm Michelle Dunscombe, and I live in Kinglake, and I missed what the question was, but I've sort of got it from what everybody's answering. So as a little person, I actually wanted to be an Olympic swimmer.
Oh wow!
So I was always passionate about the Olympics, and still have a ridiculously strange knowledge of the Olympics. So yeah, that was where my passion was. Never quite made it, but still love swimming.
Oh, fabulous! Thank you for sharing. Ruth Delaforce.
Hi everyone. I'm based in Queensland, but I work in New South Wales, the New South Wales chapter. I work with Val, and my earliest memory is I wanted to be a journalist and work in all the foreign hotspots, all the conflict zones. My father was a journalist, he travelled a lot, and my memory of that is we had to tell our teacher what we wanted to be, and this male teacher looked at me and said, I don't think women do that. So yeah, that was interesting, but been other things since that time, so yeah.
Well, thank you and welcome. Sue Jack.
Hi, yes, I'm in Victoria. I'm a CFA volunteer and a Red Cross Emergency Service volunteer, so Kathy will know me. And Val and Ruth will know me because I've done my degree, my master's, and now applying for a doctorate through Charles Sturt. So I actually can't remember what I wanted to do when I was a child. I really have no memories of that. So it's just evolved and changed as time has gone by.
That's great. Awesome. And good luck on the PhD.
Thank you.
Super Nora.
You're muted.
Oh, I think I've caught up. Yeah, Nora Ralph is the real name. I just can't work out how to change it on technology. Yeah, I'm here in hot Victoria. And when I was younger, I always wanted to be a grown-up, but now I'm not so sure. Yeah, so I work with the Red Cross Emergency Services, and I also do some work with VicPol.
Great, thank you and welcome. Now, have I missed anyone? Apart from Val, but we'll learn about Val in just a moment. All right, I think we've done everyone. So just a couple of things before we kick off. Apart from keeping your camera on, there was a couple of other principles. If you want to, so there's a couple of views that you can use. You can use the main speaker view or the gallery view. So the gallery view will put everyone's faces up, or the main speaker view puts the main person who's speaking in a really big screen. So happy for you to flick between whatever works for you, but it's just worth noting that you can change that view, which is really useful. If you pop questions in the chat as we're talking through, I know Margaret's going to keep an eye on the chat there and let us know if we are missing any questions. But also feel free to use the reactions. So at the bottom of your screen, if you click reactions, there's clapping and thumbs up as well. So feel free to, you know, bring a bit of emotion to the conversation as well if you want to. And that's probably about all. I reckon we could kick off. How are you feeling, Val? Ready to have a chat?
Oh, yeah, I'm clutching the table.
Alrighty, well, let's start with that first question. So what did you want to be when you grew up?
Oh, okay, I've got to do it too. I wanted to be an artist. And yeah, I did realise that dream. I did earn a living as an artist for about 10 years and on and off, and I still paint, but it's no way to earn a living.
Yeah.
And you've got debts and stuff. Yeah.
So then what happened? Talk us through like
what happened.
Yeah, like
well,
how did you end up where you are today?
Yeah, well, very sort of circuitous route to where I am. I did start my working life as an artist. I got very good. I was in Western Australia. We didn't call it the HSC, but as the equivalent. I got good grades. I could have gone off and studied anything, but in those days there wasn't really a gap year, and I was completely worn out. So I decided what I really wanted to do was be an artist, and I joined a studio that had a gallery. So the building's still there on Beaufort Street, but it's in Perth, but it's a sort of an op shop thing. But it was a 2-story terrace building with 3 or 4 studios and a gallery out the front on the sort of street level. And it was the end of the 70s, the early 80s. Things were just sort of cooling down after those wild decades. And yeah, so I spent 2 years learning a trade, really, much like you would have a few hundred years ago, starting off by cleaning pallets and making cups of tea and other sorts of drinks, and doing the lunch run, that sort of thing, and then progressing up to, you know, sellable works of art. So yeah, I really enjoyed that. But eventually, after a couple of years, I sort of realized I needed to take some action. So I went to Murdoch University, and Murdoch at the time was only 7 years old or less. It was a brand new uni, and they had a completely revolutionary approach to education. So which you just couldn't do these days, really, because of the requirements from various accrediting bodies. But it was a requirement that every student took a subject outside of their faculty. So I was in the Faculty of Science studying biological science, and I took philosophy. I thought I'd never seen a slacker group of students. They just lay around under trees and read books. Meanwhile, we had 3-hour labs every afternoon after a heavy lecture in the morning. But it was a good setup, really. It was a really good idea that I've continued to make connections, you know, with other disciplines, and to be able to translate something from another discipline and apply it into your own. I think you have to be able to do it these days, you know, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, but it was truly a marvelous place back then. I don't know what it's like now. Even the teaching practice was different. Yeah, and then I went back to painting. And I earned my living as an artist for around 10 years. And do you want me to keep going?
Keep going, tell us.
It feels very self-indulgent talking about yourself like
no,
that.
but it's so interesting.
Yeah, well then, you know, I moved east and started my own studio in Katoomba. Oh, well, first in Melbourne, I was with another group, and then I moved. There's a lot of security in being in a group when you're in the arts. And so I moved to Katoomba. I started my own studio, and it's a good place up here to be in the arts. It's a very small population, but everyone's quite active in all sorts of areas. So, and then I bought a house. And then you've got to pay a regular bill. And so I had to find a regular job. But in the midst of all that, my mum came to live with me, and I cared for her for 2 years before she died. And a bit like Margaret has just been through, it's quite a life-changing moment. And after she died, I sort of went, I've got to do something different, you know. What haven't I done that I really want to do? So I went back to uni. And I had to go at night because obviously I was working during the day. And the only course on offer at night was adult education. So it was rather fortuitous, actually, because it was, you know, it was hand in glove what I should have been doing all along. And yeah, that was the start of my tertiary education. I was actually 36.
Yeah, wow.
So very late starter, yeah. If that can encourage anyone who's watching and not sure if they want to go back to study. Yeah. And yeah, over to you, Lisa.
No worries. So what do you think, what is the role of tertiary education in emergency management, and how is it changing?
Well, look, when I started at Western Sydney, which was University of Western Sydney at the time. So I did my adult ed, then I did my master's, and somewhere in my master's I got picked off to, you know, be a research assistant and tutor and then lecture a few subjects. So I was always on contract, but we were approached, our little unit, the person heading it, was approached by the New South Wales Fire Brigade to get involved in their station officers and inspectors promotional program, because they wanted a university accredited course. And I think most of us will be aware that you can do a degree in nursing and policing and a number of emergency services and disaster management, but there's this massive gap still for firefighters. There's nothing. And so, you know, we were rather creative and innovative, which wasn't, it was well received after a while. It took a while for the guys, there were no women in the course, to get the hang of it. But my part of the delivery, I sort of was throwing this little paragraph, an abstract on decision making. And I went to the library and read everything I could, went online and read everything I could, and I discovered Gary Klein and naturalistic decision making. And I went, beauty, perfect fit, you know. So I had the theory and the students had the practice, and together we sort of made something of it. And that became the basis of my PhD. And from that, I applied for the job at Charles Sturt in 2005. And the reason I've given you that convoluted story is back in those days, which was only 15 years ago, there were no PhDs in disaster or emergency. There was no one graduating with that as their focus. There were no, when I applied for my job, there were 3 applicants and the other 2 were over 60. They were retired police. And obviously the university wanted someone research active. So they sort of went, oh, okay, you can have it. If I applied for my job today, I don't think I'd get it because the tertiary education sector has beautifully expanded and burgeoned into all sorts of different areas. And there'd be multiple people that could apply for that job at that moment in time with what I had. I wouldn't have been successful today. So I think the sector is blossoming. I mean, prior to 9/11, I don't think anyone in the general public actually even knew the term emergency management. I think you had to explain it. And now everyone is across the concept at least. So that's pretty rapid. That's a pretty rapid education for the public, and it's a rapid expansion of tertiary level courses that has happened. So
absolutely. And I remember when we caught up, Val, and you mentioned about people not knowing about the word, you know, what is emergency management? Because when I first moved over and I was telling friends at home that I worked in emergency management, they would ask me if I worked in a hospital emergency department.
Yes, exactly. And if you did a word, if you did a word search in a database, that's what you got, nursing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's interesting, isn't it? So thank you for that. So moving, progressing on that discussion a little bit, what do you think it means with this evolution of emergency management tertiary education? What does that mean for our volunteers and volunteerism, do you think?
Well, look, I think it means opportunity. I'd have to say we have a lot of volunteers from fire services in our degrees. I think it means that there's an opportunity because people sort of try things out, you know, I'll see what the SES is like. Then they discover I was made for this. How can I, you know, become full-time? Well, these days you've got to have a tertiary level qualification. So I think it's a leg up, but I don't think it's any substitute for experience. So I used to teach in TAFE and I loved TAFE because there was that practical element. I think the tertiary level is increasingly becoming a priority if you want promotion or career progression. And so I think it's increasingly important for volunteers because, you know, I have a student at the moment who's sort of looking at, he's worn a volunteer cap for 35 years and a paid emergency management professional for the same amount of time. And he got a bit jaded turning out as a volunteer and not being taken seriously, turning out in a different uniform and suddenly everything changes. And so he's looking at that sort of dichotomy. But I think that space is going to blur. The volunteer career space is going to blur a bit. And I think tertiary education is always a leg up into those spots. So. I don't know if that answers the question.
No, it absolutely does. I thought I might just pause there in case anyone's got any questions or comments that they wanted to add to that. And if anything's come through the chat there, Margaret.
No questions in the chat yet, so.
Oh, come on, guys, give me a diversion. No, it's okay.
All right, well, we might move along. So how are women represented in emergency management tertiary education?
Look, that's an interesting question, because when I commenced at Charles Sturt in 2005, I, through a series of actions, had to do a snapshot baseline study of our students, where they came from, you know, what services they were in, whether they were career and volunteer, and if they were male or female. And really 15 years later, I should repeat that, because there were hardly any women, hardly. I had this bar chart with red at the top for women and the blue for men, and it was just ridiculous. And I think part of the reason was that most people entering the degree came from an emergency service, which was predominantly male. Now, when we look at our current classes, anecdotally, I'd have to say it's almost 50-50. I could be wrong in some places, but certainly as we progress into the masters and into the doctorate, the women sort of equal or outweigh the male numbers. Yeah. And I think it's increasingly a friendlier space. It's more inviting. There's been a lot of ground's been broken by some very brave people. And we're all flooding in and taking advantage of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Anyone else have any comments about women and tertiary education and emergency management?
I just thought of a question just as you were doing that last bit, Valerie. So do you think there are, this may be controversial, but do you think there are any differences between the students that come through now based on their gender? Are there differences in approach or differences in the way we think that emerge in the...
No, I've often thought about that, and no, I can't see differences between gender, but I can see differences overall in the students. So I think there's a huge shift. So, and maybe it's because we sort of, well, one of the things I did when I got my hands on the controls was change the entry requirements so that people could enter the undergrad, the postgrad. It wasn't completely in my purview, but we changed the entry requirements so that a broader range of people could sign up for the degrees. So instead of belonging to an emergency service per se, or being an emergency manager, say in a local council, you might be working for Sydney Water and emergency management flopped onto your desk. You might be a social worker out in the community, a district nurse. You know, the connection could be a little more tenuous than your full-time mission. And I think that's really strengthened the degree, because the students, when I look back 15 years ago, they were very regimental. They approached study from the perspective of, tell me what I've got to do and I'll do it. Like they come out of a hierarchical organisation. They just wanted to know the right way, and trying to get them to think for themselves and actually say there isn't a right way, just justify your reasoning. It was just terrifying for them. They hated it. And I think these days, because I'm not teaching in the undergrad, so I guess I'm a bit out of touch with that, but in the masters and the doctorate, I see people willing to give that thought a go. They may not accept it, agree with it, but they'll test it out. And that's a huge sort of change in the student mindset. And I think it's really great. And I thought part of it's our earlier high school education as well. It's encouraging people to think critically. So I think we're we're getting the spin-off now. But it's not, I can't see a gender differentiation yet. Might not be looking hard enough. Yeah.
So I've seen a couple of queries come through. So one from Midge has come through about, essentially, do you have any suggestions about someone who is doing kind of tertiary education in emergency management, how they can get more involved in it from a practitioner perspective, if you've got any advice?
Yeah, look, I've seen this problem a fair bit, and that is that when you've got a degree, you're a threat. So I think look, I think sometimes we forget that it takes time for change to take place. So if I go back to like 2001 to 2004 or 5, when we had those station officers and inspectors, those station officers who transitioned to inspectors, they're now sitting, it's 15 years later, those that are left are now assistant commissioners and chief superintendents. And on the odd occasion, I get an email out of the blue saying, hey, Val, you know that project that I did? Well, now I'm able to implement it. It's kind of like the entry isn't as fast as we think it's going to be. And I guess it's a hard situation if you don't get a leg up. Yeah, it's very hard.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it does take time to
It
create
does take
change.
time to get to that place where, yeah, it doesn't help you much, Margaret, but yeah, maybe someone else can answer that question.
Does anyone have any advice?
How to break through that wall. Actually, we should have my colleague Donna Bridges has just finished a whole research project on gender and the trades, and how women in the trades actually. And you know what I noticed was quite a few women, they really received positive feedback from their employers, like, oh, I'm going to do this again, I'll always have girls. But for the girls themselves, as soon as they were qualified and could do it, they branched out and started their own business so that they weren't subject to some of those glass ceilings that they experience. So yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sue Jack actually added that apparently it's very helpful if you have a good network into the area.
Yeah.
So it's probably it's a fabulous thing that you're a part of OR. So hopefully we can help with broadening your network across emergency management as well.
Yeah.
And I see that Mandy had a question, I think, about where you're working now, which is Charles Sturt, right?
Yes, I'm at Charles Sturt. I'm hanging on, see my fingernails. We've had 2 sets of voluntary separations on offer, but you're not necessarily accepted if you apply. So yeah, I'm a bit too young, but not old enough.
Interesting times, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, you know, in the introduction, I spoke about you being a founding member of the Disaster and Community Resilience Research Group. Did you want to tell us a little bit about that and how that came to be?
Yes, well, originally it was a Bangladesh and Australia Community Resilience Research Group, and it really started around the lunch table. And that's a sad outcome of COVID, that we can't sit around the lunch table anymore and connect with people. I was in a lovely school that had psychology and political science, all sorts of disparate kind of disciplines, English literature. And there were just 3 or 4 of us that used to sit around and chat. And one of my colleagues was from Bangladesh. He's still my colleague. And he used to challenge us and say, you know, it's quite different over in Bangladesh. Until one day we just went, oh, come on then. Okay, well, let's find out. So we formed a little research group, and I actually went to Bangladesh. What an experience. It's like going back 300 years. It's really and truly quite an eye-opener. And I also got violently ill and can't return. But anyway, from that, we formed a connection with Chris Newton, actually, and a few of the neighbourhood centre managers in the mountains. We were very, I guess the word is fortuitous. We were approached by a few neighbourhood centres, one in particular, to conduct an evaluation of whatever was of vulnerable people, the needs of vulnerable people. And as you know, or may not know, ethics processes at unis are quite protracted. And we wanted to interview people who are highly vulnerable. They had carers. And anyway, we got through the ethics, and the bushfires came through the mountains in October 2013. Well, there we were sitting with an ethics application approved to research vulnerable people and the community, and there was a stricken community. And so we set about doing our data collection with vulnerable people. And as we went around, we were facilitated access to these people and these focus groups through the neighbourhood centre managers and other local leaders. And every time we had contact with a local leader, I thought, I'm more interested in you. And so we'd go and do the interviews with the vulnerable people, and we wrote it all up nicely. But actually my interest was piqued by how are these people managing, because my experience was with emergency services. Pizzas arrive after 4 hours. You've got bottles of refreshments sitting everywhere, and there's replacements, and there's equipment and resources. Everyone got a new uniform. And here I was in the community sector, and there was absolutely zero being fed into these people who were holding the fort, so to speak. So that really piqued my interest, and I've been there ever since. It's much safer than Bangladesh too.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's the connection.
That's fabulous. A question's come through. As you said earlier, people seem to grasp emergency management. How do you explain or think people understand community/disaster resilience?
I think that's a tough one and that's why the area of resilience is so difficult to nail down, because it's one of those things that's interpreted by its discipline. And in fact, that was an assignment question I set. How would you, in your discipline, define resilience? Because if you're a structural engineer, you're either the building is resilient or it's not. And that's where the whole concept came from. And so when you start talking about scales of resilience and measuring resilience, they look at you like you're mad. Things have changed now, but that I think of it like the word sale. It's becoming a little bit overused, giant sale. We all go, yeah, right. We saw that item last week and it was, that price. So we're a bit jaded with the word, and I think that's why we're getting a few other words like adaptive resilience and, psychosocial resilience. We're getting all sorts of different, which is good, flavors to extrapolate on that word. I still think it's central in its importance because it's like a pinion that connects the community, the emergency services. It is a central focus. I think I might have gone off track there, but anyway, you've got to stop me on that subject.
No, I think it's extremely interesting.
Yeah. You're on mute, Lisa, so I can't lip read.
I'm sorry. Does anyone have any further kind of comments or questions about the, you know, the definition of a community/disaster resilience and how that can be interpreted?
I was just going to comment, if that's okay. And I agree, Val, it's really challenging. I think especially now I'm working with local government, and it's especially with the scale of this event, like doing recovery, with the scale of an event that we're seeing especially along the east coast of Australia and the south. It's you know, a lot of people are working in this space that have never had any experience in it before. And so I think all of these terms can be really confusing, but I think the positive thing of it is to grasp like the holistic and integrated nature of things, at least. But that's right, everyone's interpretation of it is so different. Even across council, no one has a you know, homogenous, like an understanding of the same understanding of the definition. But I think that it's true, it makes it challenging, but then it also is great because you can kind of, you know, use it how you need with each individual depending on what you need from them.
Yeah,
but it is challenging.
I think you're absolutely spot on there. I think that actually the complexity of it reflects the reality of it. It's not some theoretical kind of, you know, ivory tower construct. It's actually based, resilience is actually based on the ground in community, and therefore it's a bit messy. And it can't be pinned down with a nail and hammer, you know. It's going to always morph, and there'll always, and I think, you know, there was that moment when suddenly vulnerability was entered into the speak about it, into the vocabulary, and suddenly we had a scale, vulnerable to resilient, and, you know, all sorts of interpretations around that. And I think that's just going to continue to happen and fill out and strengthen. Yeah.
Thanks, Ashley, for sharing that question. Margaret had a question around, do you have any reflections on the findings of the Royal Commission? She's worried that the new single agency will just do what has been done before, no innovation or change. Do you have any concerns or thoughts about the future of our sector?
I was just flicking through the recommendations before we came online, actually, because after, well, coming from a tertiary institution, after Black Saturday, one of the recommendations was for tertiary education, or the education of emergency managers. But the education this time was focused on the community. I think it's a pivotal moment in time, and it really, I think we underestimate the importance of who's at the helm, especially at the embryonic start of something, and how that colours and flavours how this is going to pan out. So yes, there are concerns, but I think most of those recommendations were fairly predictable. The one thing that I found interesting, which I think is positive, well, there's more than one positive, but is the need for recommendations to be addressed, like some kind of accountability, because we haven't seen that up until now. You know, there's many thousands of recommendations that have been made. Some of them are the same ones over and over and over again, especially in the area of communications. And nothing much changes because there's no accountability for change. So I think that is going to be a positive aspect. But as with everything, as with, for instance, a national strategy for disaster resilience, which sort of was born out of the 2009 fires in Victoria, if it just remains a strategy with no guidelines for implementation, then everyone interprets it how they're going to apply it themselves, and then there's no consistency. Not that you have to have consistency, but yeah, I'd rather hear your response to that, Margaret, than mine. Anyway.
I think it's a whole topic we could have a conversation about.
Yeah, yeah. It's early days yet.
We've got a couple more questions coming through, which is great.
Oh, good.
Do you have any strategies or success increasing capacity of those community hub leaders that you met post bushfires? Any hints?
Yeah, well, look, what we've developed, and it got put on hold because they're all working in recovery, and also my funding got swiped back by the university. So for a number of reasons, I haven't progressed it beyond publication. But what I constructed was a fairly basic guideline for the personal preparation of community leaders. So I think most community leaders are fairly well aware of, you know, business continuity tactics, and, you know, they're bombarded with that stuff. But what I found was, as individuals, how can you prepare yourself to be a leader in a community where you live personally and your role as a professional coincide. So it's quite different if you live in a bustling city. For instance, you know, I don't know if you know, but taxi drivers in Sydney, the chances of picking up the same person twice are just about zero. Up in, say, Katoomba, it's almost 100%. So if you live in a small community or, you know, a rural or regional area, you've got that blurred boundary between your personal life and your professional life. And that's what I found in my interviews with community leaders, which we conducted in 2014 and then in 2018. To be honest, I was quite upset for quite a number of months after that second series of interviews, because, you know, there was such a feeling of quiet desperation. These people had actually poured out their life in the recovery arena, and there still was no recognition, no resourcing, no support. And that's sort of become my mission, is just to raise those issues continuously until something happens. And so if you want to email me, I do have a personal preparation guideline for community leaders. It's very basic. You could almost predict it yourself, but it's like an emergency management kit list. You know what's on it, but do you have one? You know, it's pinned to the kitchen wall. How much of it have you accomplished? So it's kind of one of those things where, yeah, I know I should do that, but have you done it? So, and it's still in a pilot phase. So feel free to email me and I'll send you what I've got.
And I've posted your email address in the chat there, Val.
Yeah. I'll have some work to do then.
No, and as you were speaking, I'm reflecting of when I saw you present at the Australia and New Zealand Disaster and Emergency Management Conference last year on that exact topic. And I remember sitting there and I guess it had never come front of mind about the impact on community leaders, and that, you know, how overwhelming that must be. And those comments you said around, you know, we all sit around with our refreshments and our dinner arriving in a incident control centre or state control centre or regional control centre, whatever it might be. But for community, like on the ground, it's not like that. It's so different. And I can only imagine what it must be like when you're working and living in a community that's impacted by emergencies, when because I know how hard it is to kind of pull myself away from emergencies, you know, at the state level, let alone being able to take some time and self-care and you know, look after yourself when you're on the ground. So it's pretty huge.
It is. And I guess one of the examples that stuck out to me the most was someone who said to me, I took to shopping at midnight so that I didn't bump into any clients, because they're also my neighbours and my friends. And, you know, and this person also said to me, you know, if I shopped after school with my kids, I could be held up for an hour in the aisle at the shopping centre, and I didn't want my kids to hear those stories and that grief. I didn't want them to be further exposed. So I mean, just thinking about how you're gonna do your shopping before. I mean, it's just a basic thing we do. You know, you don't ever give thought to it. But I've since discovered a lot of GPs do the same thing. They shop very late at night in disguise, you know, a hat pulled.
Or they're diagnosing conditions down the aisles. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's one other comment here, and I'm conscious of time, so we'll there's a comment and one last question, so that'll take us up to 6 o'clock. So the comment is, I wonder if we would see some more change if emergency management embraced a community development approach across the board. I'm interested in Val's thoughts.
Yes, now that's a tricky one. I do have a student working in that area, and they've just presented their proposal, and they've really, a couple of them actually, really had to struggle to get their point of view heard. Traditionally, emergency services research the community. You know, they hold information. They try and gain from the community what the community would prefer in terms of how to reach them, how to communicate with them, and then the community has things done to them by emergency services. You know, oh well, we know that, you know, you'll come if we hold this event at this time on this day, so we're going to do that. Instead of a understanding that community engagement as a collaborative process where we're on equal grounds, and how does that work? And I think the Blue Mountains community is really sort of experienced and streaking ahead and in that area because of experience. But when I talk to people on both sides, emergency services and community services in other areas that are sort of relatively calm and unaffected by major events, it still is, you know, it's still not a collaborative approach. You know, I think one of the strongest things that Chris has headed up is publishing a calendar in the local paper of various events over the lead up. For us, it's the lead up to the fire season. It could be another lead up to something else in another community. But what it demonstrates is that all those services have spoken to each other, and they're not putting their things on at the same time on the same day. They're turning out to each other's events. I mean, I think that's just the culmination of years of effort. And it's just a beautiful example of what collaboration should be. So no one's event is more important than someone else's. It's all there for the public to see. And what it says to the community, subconsciously or consciously, is all of these services are interrelated. They know each other, and they've collaborated on this public front. So yeah, community engagement is a tricky, it's not my strongest point, but for me, it's a tricky term because it often ends up with, yeah, it's like a survey. Is it going to be used for good or bad?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Chris actually has her hand up. Did you want to make a comment?
Can we hear you?
I definitely can.
Oh, we can't.
We can't hear you, Chris. Have you got a microphone somewhere you can breathe into?
No, I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, pop it in the chat.
Yeah.
While she's doing that, the last question I had for you, Val, was what is the future for emergency management tertiary education? Not a small question. Sorry about that.
Yeah, that's a big one. I think it's going to, the future of tertiary education per se, not just emergency management, is going to change dramatically. I think 5 years from now, we won't recognise what we've got. I know every contact I have at a university, they're all working on what they're calling MicroSubjects, microcredit. We're calling it teaching online, or something similar, but MicroSubjects. So the future is going to be smaller units, you know, like if you do a TAFE program you do modules. I know I've enrolled in TAFE to do Photoshop or whatever, and when I get my transcript at the end of the session, I'm like, I didn't know I was enrolled in all of those units. You know, I thought I was enrolled in how to use Photoshop, but there's like 12 things that are ticked off. And I think it's going to be a bit like that. Those modules, which we're calling MicroSubjects, and other unis have other names, instead of, say, being worth 10 points, they'll be worth 5. And you'll be able to progress at your own speed, submit assignments. For our uni, it'll be the students, we're already trialling it, the students actually send to us what days they're going to submit those assignments. I know at Central Queensland Uni, it could be any time. So they just have a pool of assignments and markers go in and pick them off. We can't work out how they do it. So we're a little bit more constrained, but you could get the idea that people will be able to study small chunks intensively when it suits them, rather than having to wait for the start of session and the close of session. You might finish that subject in 2 weeks instead of 2 months because you're on long service leave. And don't get me wrong, but part of all of this is to attract more students, to make our programs more attractive, because student feedback is, you know, why do we have to have this big long break at Christmas? I could have finished my degree last year. So you sort of get what you ask for. But I think in terms of emergency management, it's going to follow that. And it'll work for us, because some people, like over COVID, some people were locked down at home. They just sped through their assignments. Other people had to take leave of absence because they were just overworked, overrun, and acting up, and just couldn't manage the subject load. So I think it's going to be horses for courses in the future. Yeah.
No, that's a great thought, and it's actually bang on 6 o'clock, so I might close. There's a few comments and conversation happening in the chat, Val, so if you get a moment, it might be worth just having a read. But I just want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I think this will be our last org conversation for the year, but I know Margaret and the rest of the network have great plans for a bit of a Christmas function in December for that date that we had advertised on Facebook. So more to come there. So there will be something before we all break for the Christmas New Year. So, and particularly Val, thank you so much for giving us an hour of your time, talking us through your career, through emergency management, through tertiary education, and your perspectives on that. It's been insightful from me personally, but I'm sure everyone else has got something out of it as well, and they will likely reach out since I've shared your email there, so I hope you don't mind. But thank you all.
That's lovely. Thank you. Thank you everyone for tuning in and bearing with my long-winded explanations. Is that it? What do those hands mean? Have you got a question?
No, it's clapping, I think.
Oh, is it okay?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Just see if there's anyone who's sticking around with the question. See you, Chris. Bye. 10 new messages.